Colonial Army and Civil Administration. In 1600, the East India Company got a charter from the British Queen Elizabeth I for trade with India. Every 20 years, the charter was renewed and the company continued its trade with India. Many trade settlements were set up in different parts of India. By the end of the 18th century, these traders were no longer satisfied with only trade, but dreamt of acquiring political power. They acquired vast territories, and to protect them, they set up an administrative structure. The main aim was to increase the company's profit, make the Indian possessions profitable for the British, and strengthen the British power in India. Now we shall study how the British consolidated their empire by establishing a strong administrative setup. Political impact of the British rule. When the officials of the East India Company acquired control over Bengal in 1765, they had little intention of making any innovations in its administration. They only desired to carry on profitable trade and to collect taxes for remission to England. From 1762 to 1772, Indian officials were allowed to function as before, but under the overall control of the British governor and British officials. In 1772, the company ended the dual government and undertook to administer Bengal directly through its own set of officials. The East India Company at this time was a commercial body designed to trade with the East. But during the period between the Pitt's India Act, 1784, and the Charter Act of 1833, the company was gradually relieved of its long-held trading privileges in the East. Simultaneously, it grew to be a significant power in India, responsible for the government of a very large population spread over an immense area. The English realized that if the country was to supply regular revenue, it had to be properly governed. The Regulating Act of 1773 was a first step in this direction. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General, under the provisions of the Act, tried to maintain as much of the structure of the Mughal administration as possible. The machinery of government went on as before. The British were left free to concentrate on revenue collection and trade. Hastings' successor, Lord Cornwallis, changed all this. He scrapped the old system by a new one in which the British openly ruled Bengal. They formulated many acts to bring administrative reforms. Some of the important acts were Regulating Act 1773, Pitt's India Act 1784, the Charter Act 1793, the Charter Act 1813, the Charter Act 1833, the Charter Act 1853, the Act for the Better Government of India 1858, the Indian Councils Act 1861, the Indian Councils Act 1892, Minto-Morley Reforms 1909, the Government of India Act 1919, the Government of India Act 1935, the Regulating Act 1773. The chaotic condition of the company forced the British Parliament to pass the Regulating Act in 1773 to regulate its work. Main provisions of the Regulating Act. The main provisions of the Regulating Act were: the Governor of Bengal was made the Governor-General of British India. Warren Hastings was appointed the first Governor-General of India. There would be a council of 4 members to assist the Governor-General. All the decisions in the council were to be made by majority of votes. The Governor-General was given a casting vote in the case of tie. The Governor-General was empowered to control the presidencies of Bombay and Madras in matters of war and peace with the native states. But in case of emergency or on receipt of special orders from England, they could act on their own. The Act provided for a Supreme Court at Calcutta with the Chief Justice and 3 assistant judges. Sir Elijah MP was appointed the Chief Justice. The Supreme Court was empowered to try civil, criminal, and other cases. Cases were to be tried by means of a jury. The directors of the company were required to submit their accounts of income and expenditure before the British Treasury. Drawbacks of the Act. The Regulating Act marked the first step towards parliamentary control over the company and towards a centralized administration in India. But it had many defects which seriously hampered its purpose. The Governor-General had no control over the members of his council. He had only a casting vote. The relations of the Supreme Court and the Governor-General and his council were not clear. The governors of Bombay and Madras presidencies were not brought under the Governor-General's control. They could act by themselves under the guise of emergency. Under these circumstances, it was necessary to pass another act to remove these defects. Pitt's India Act, 1784. As the Regulating Act had many defects, it was necessary to pass another act to remove these defects. Even after the enactment of the Regulating Act, affairs in India had not improved. Corruption in India had not been removed completely. The American War of Independence resulted in the loss of 13 American colonies. It gave a severe blow to the British trade. The English wanted to strengthen their control over India. So, Pitt's India Act was passed in 1784. It is called Pitt's India Act because the bill was moved by the British Prime Minister Pitt the Younger. The main provisions of this act were the political and commercial functions of the company were separated. The board of directors was to only look after the commercial activities of the company. This act created a board of control to supervise, direct, and control the political affairs of the company. The board of control was to consist of 6 members. They were to be appointed by the king and were to hold office on his pleasure. The expenses of the board of control were to be borne by the company. The council of the Governor-General was to consist of 3 members instead of 4. One of them was to be the Commander-in-Chief of India. The Governor-General in council was to have full power to superintend, direct, and control the presidencies of Bombay and Madras. The governors' councils in the presidencies of Bombay and Madras were also to consist of 3 members. The Governor-General could declare war or make peace after getting the permission of the Board of Control. Importance of the Act. The Pitt's India Act is a landmark in the constitutional history of India. It introduced the system of dual control from England. The Act helped the unification of India by making the Governor-General supreme over the governors of other presidencies. The British Parliament claimed supremacy over the company's possessions in India. The Pitt's India Act lasted till 1858, when the Government of India directly passed into the hands of the British Crown. The Charter Acts. The Charter Acts were originally passed by the Parliament once in 20 years, but was allowed to retain its rights of trading with China. This Act also allowed other British merchants to trade with India. Another important feature of the Act was that for the first time, the company was instructed to allot a sum of rupees 1 lakh for encouraging education among Indians. This meant that now the Parliament tried to make the company responsible for the well-being of its Indian subjects, which was neglected so far. The Charter Act of 1833. In 1833, another important Charter Act was passed, which brought important changes in the administration. The East India Company was deprived of all its trade privilege, including its tea trade with China. The company was allowed to retain its territorial possessions for a further period of 20 years. But, under the supervision of the Board of Control, the company was now asked to clear all debts to its shareholders from the Indian revenue. Thus, By this act, the company lost all its commercial privileges but held on to only the political power. The act also made changes in the nature of Indian administration. The Calcutta government, under the Governor General, assumed greater power, and the Madras and the Bombay governors lost their powers of making laws. A new member was added to the Council of the Governor General for the purpose of making laws. He was known as the Law Member. In short, the power was centralized in Calcutta government, and the Governor General became the most powerful official in the company's Indian administration. The Charter Act of 1858. Another Charter Act was passed in 1858 with a council of 6 members set up to make laws for the Indian subjects of the company. This was probably the beginning of a legislative council. Other administrative agencies through which the government exercised power were the civil service, the army, the police, and the judicial system. Civilian administration, the civil service. All the officials through whom the central administration was carried out constituted the civil service. Lord Cornwallis, who became the Governor General in 1793, was the real founder of the civil service. He took great care to improve the standard of the civil service. He increased the salary of the officials, but at the same time introduced many rules to check corruption. These rules were known as Cornwallis Code. In course of time, the civil service in India became an important part of British administration in India. The prestige and the attractive salary of the service attracted well-educated young men from the influential families of England. Gradually, these officials had to be specially trained for the Indian affairs. For the smooth functioning of administrative work, they had to learn Indian languages and had to be acquainted with history, culture, social and geographical conditions of India. The Fort William College was set up in Calcutta in 1801 to train and teach the young civil servants in these areas. For the same purpose, the East Indian College was set up later in Haileybury in England. After 1853, the recruitment of these officials was made through competitive examinations. Since the time of Cornwallis, all the high posts at the district level were manned by civil servants. The most important among them were the collectors, who collected revenue for the company, magistrates, who maintained law and order in the district, and judges, who were in charge of the judicial service. The colonial army. The army was another important pillar of the British regime in India. It was mainly organized to push the colonial interests of the English. It played 3 important roles in the expansion of the British Empire. By 1857, the East India Company firmly established its political power by conquering vast territories in India. To achieve this, they needed a well-disciplined, trained army. The British Army consisted of Indian soldiers called sepoys. All high posts were reserved for the British. The sepoys could rise only to the rank of the subedar. As the company paid them well, they were loyal to the British in the beginning. Later, they became discontented for various reasons and rose in revolt in 1857. The police. Another important agency through which law and order was maintained was the police. The police was the third important pillar of the British rule. Earlier, the police duties were assigned to zamindars, but soon they were relieved of these duties, and a separate police department was created by Lord Cornwallis. Lord Cornwallis, for the first time, organized a regular police and created the post of Superintendent of Police, who was in charge of a district. For police functions, districts were divided into a number of thanas. These thanas were placed under Indian officer known as Daroga. As before, Indian kotwals and chowkidars were responsible for the prevention of crime by checking robberies and thefts at the village level. In village, the watchman had to carry out his duty. The police succeeded in curbing the anti-social elements like the thugs, thieves, and dacoits, and it also helped in suppressing the growing national spirit. Only the English were considered fit for higher posts of responsibility. In fact, the police could never become popular among Indian people because it was more a source of harassment rather than help. Judicial organization. Judicial system is an important part of any administration. The laws are made by the government, but it is also important to make provisions to see that these laws are not violated. Anybody who violated the laws must be tried in the courts of law, and the guilty should be punished. To meet these requirements, law courts were set up by the British. In the beginning, the administration of justice was carried out on the basis of traditional laws of the Indians. The Shastras, in case of the Hindus, and the Shariat, in case of the Muslims, formed the basis of justice. Warren Hastings established a civil and a criminal court in each district. 2 Court of Appeal, viz. Sadar Diwani Adalat and Sadar Nizamat Adalat, were also set up. A digest of the Hindu and Muslim laws was compiled to guide the judges. In 1774, the Supreme Court was established at Calcutta to try the servants of the company. Nandakumar, a collector of taxes, was sentenced to death by the Supreme Court under British law. The Indians greatly resented against it. In 1781, it was decided that the English laws would be applicable to Englishmen in India and not to the Indians. In 1793, the acceptable customs of the Indians were compiled. The new code was known as the Bengal Regulations 1793. Thus, a system of written laws was introduced in India for the first time. However, the Indian system of law was fully codified in 1833 by the Indian Law Commission under Lord Macaulay. The new system of law was known as the Indian Penal Code, the Civil Procedure Code, and the Code of Criminal Procedure. In 1865, the Sadar Diwani and the Sadar Nizamat Adalats were abolished, and high courts were established at Calcutta, Madras, and the rule of law. The British established the rule of law in India, which meant that all people were equal before the law. All distinctions based on caste and religion were done away with. The characteristic features of the British judicial system are: enacted laws replaced customary laws. Judicial uniformity was established with the codification of laws that applied to both the ruler and the ruled. Litigation, that is, the process of lawsuits, became very expensive and hence became out of reach for the poor masses. Although the judicial system professed equality before the law, the Europeans were tried in special courts by the British judges. One striking feature of the British administration in India was that the British formed a deliberate policy of excluding Indians from all high posts in civil service, army, police, and judiciary. It was clear that the British did not trust the ability, integrity, and honesty of the Indians. They felt it would be much easier to consolidate the British rule in India with the help of British officials who understood their system better. The British Parliament thus passed various laws and exercised control over Indian administration through the Board of Control in India. The Governor-General with his council members set up an elaborate administrative structure with the help of civil service, army, police, and judiciary. The British established the rule of law, but the Europeans and Indians were never regarded as equal before the law. Finally, as the laws were codified, the government began to run according to the written laws instead of the whims of the rulers.